Hello everybody and welcome back to the Creature Flesh workshop and part 7 of our making a silicone mask inspired by The Last of Us. So I just want to quickly recap what we've done in this series so far. In the first couple of episodes we sculpted our silicone mask on our head form with monster clay. We went through the primary, secondary and tertiary forms and the fine details, and then we created a resin mold from that sculpture, a 2-part mold that we then demolded, pulled out all of the clay, cleaned it all up and finished it off by drilling in some bolt holes, some bleeder holes for that silicone, and then tidying up all of the edge. And then in our last video we created our power mesh hood that's going to encapsulate into that silicone mask when we pour it to make it nice and strong. So we've done a lot of stuff so far, and please, if you haven't seen those episodes, go back and check those out. But now comes the really exciting part, and that is pouring the silicone into our mold and hoping that we've done everything correctly. Let's get into the video. So we need to do a little bit of prepping of our mold before we can put it together and pour the silicone in. Now one of those things is adding a mold release. Now you don't really need a mold release with silicone because nothing sticks to silicone. But when we've poured it into our mold, it is going to create a little bit of a vacuum. And what we don't want to happen is when we pull that mold open that it tears our mask inside. So we are going to use a mold release, and that's one that I've actually made. And it's this stuff here. So this is a combination of about 70% isopropyl alcohol and about 30% washing up liquid or dish soap, whatever you call it. So this mixed together is going to create a really good mold release, because when we demold our mask, we're going to be able to spray some isopropyl alcohol into the mold to then start breaking this stuff down again to help us demold. So we are going to mist a little bit of this over our molds. The alcohol will dry and it will leave a very thin layer of soap. So we're going to do that several times to build up a nice layer of mold release. On to the next step. Now I've laid our head form temporarily into our mold, and what I'm checking for is the gap between the mold and the head form. And you can see as we look around, we can see exactly how thick our mask is going to be at certain points around the edge of that mold. And I can see here on the ear is going to be extremely thin. So what I can do is I can actually shave down our head form to give us a few more millimeters of space. Because even though I'm probably going to have some bits to patch, I want to make sure that I've got the least amount of patching after we pull our mask out. Okay, that's looking a lot better. I've definitely got a better gap now in between the head form and the mold. Now there's a little bit of prep work with our power mesh hood. Now we want to make sure that any of the seam lines where the fabric is kind of ruffled up and bunched up in places, we want to try and flatten those bits out as much as we can so that they're not poking through the silicone when we demold. We also want to make sure that the fabric doesn't get pinched when we close that mold together, because again that's going to be poking out of the silicone and we're going to have to patch that. So I'm going to be using a solution of PVA glue and water mixed together, and I'm just going to put a very, very thin layer on our head form, put our hood back on, and just stick parts of that hood down in places where it's kind of bunching up and sticking out. Now I just want to dry that off a little bit so we can make it tacky before we put that hood back on. Okay, so that's flattened it down a little bit. It should be enough. I have noticed though as well, now we need to measure out our silicone. And you're probably wondering, how do we know how much silicone that we need? Well, if you cast your minds back to the demolding video where we stripped out all of the clay from our mold, we kept that clay in our little pots here. And the reason we did that is we can now weigh that clay to then calculate exactly how much silicone we need. So I'm going to zero this with an empty bucket. So we've got 1010 grams in that one. And 967 in that one. So that gives us a total of 1979 grams. So there's some really clever calculations that somebody's worked out in calculating the mass of silicone and the mass of clay and what the equals will be. But essentially you need around about 79% of silicone by weight in comparison to the clay. So we've got 979 grams of clay. That means we need 1,566 grams of silicone. There's some clever people out there that could probably work that out on a calculator. I just ran it through an AI website and that's the figure that it gave me. So now we know how much silicone we need. We can now start to measure that out. And I'm going to measure out a little bit more than I need to compensate for leakage and also so we can use that in patching afterwards. So let's start weighing out our silicone. So we're going to be using EcoFlex, which is a type of platinum silicone. Now, platinum silicone is traditionally used in film and TV for makeup, prosthetics, appliances, and props, and even in the medical industry to make replicas of body parts. And the reason platinum silicone is used is because when it cures, it has a very similar texture to human skin. It's very soft, and it's also semi-translucent as well. Now we're going to be using EcoFlex 0030, and essentially those numbers just mean how hard the silicone is going to be once it's cured. Now silicone is measured in a Shore hardness scale, and something like 00 or 0010 might be used for a makeup appliance, whereas something like 0020 or 0030 is a little bit tougher. It's still got that softness of silicone and the benefit of it being flexible. So for masks it's great because you can make expressions, but also silicone can be prone to tearing. So that's why we use a slightly tougher one for something like a pullover mask. So it's a 1-to-1 mix ratio, so really easy. I mix it by weight, but you can also mix it by volume. And we're going to measure up some of part A and add our pigment to it, because as soon as we mix part A and B together, that time limit starts, and we want to make sure we've got it the right color before we do that. So let's go ahead and pour out some of the part A. Now before I pour this, I want to give it a good mix, because when these are sitting on the shelf, they can separate a little bit and the oils separate from the silicone. We're going to give that a good mix. Now you'll notice that I've marked a little A on this one, and it's really important when you're mixing silicones that will instantly start to cure when you mix them together, is to mark all of your mixing sticks and anything that's going to go into that silicone, or even the pots that you might pour that silicone in. Now this one had been sitting around on the shelf for a little while, so it has separated quite a lot. But if you're buying this stuff fresh, you shouldn't have to mix it quite as much as this. I'm also, while I'm mixing, incorporating quite a lot of bubbles, but we've got a solution for that after we've mixed it together. Okay, now it's nicely mixed. We're going to measure that out into one of our pots. So as I said before, we need about 1,566 grams of silicone. I'm going to overcompensate and do 1,800, so then I've got enough left over for leakage and for patching as well. So I need 900 of each. Okay, now we've got that poured out, we can now add some pigment into it to start making it look more like the base tone of our mask. I'm also going to mark which one this is. So I'm going with a basic flesh tone, but I'm going to add in some green as well. And this is going to kind of make it more of a base color, and it's going to give us a nice color to work off when we're painting our mask. Now this stuff goes a very, very long way. We want to make sure that we don't put too much of this in, because if we do, it's going to become too opaque and it's going to lose that realistic translucency that skin has. Again, we've marked our sticks. Now there is a little trick that we can do to see roughly how opaque the silicone is going to be, and that's drawing a little dot on the end of our stick. And once we mix that, we can then count down to around 3 to 5 seconds. If we can see that dot too quickly, then we know that we need to add more pigment. You can see just adding a few drops already makes the whole thing a different color. Now we can go a little bit too much with this, because remember, we're going to mix it with exactly the same amount of silicone again. So that is going to thin out that solution and make it more translucent. Now I'm going to add a bit of the green. Because this is darker, I'm going to go very sparingly. Okay, let's give it a little test. 1, 2, 3. I'd probably say it needs a little bit more. So that's almost there. Making sure I'm scraping the edges. Tiny bit more. And it's best to add a little bit at a time rather than overdo it, because once you put too much in, there's no way of getting it out again. Okay, that's looking good. Okay, I think we're ready to mix in part B. So we incorporated quite a lot of bubbles in that mixing process. So now what we need to do is get those bubbles out. And the way we're going to do that is with a degassing chamber, or a vacuum chamber, which is one of these. So this is the chamber, and then over here we've got our pump. We turn that pump on, and then activates, and you can see that pressure gauge is going up, and all of that air is getting sucked out of the chamber, and therefore sucking any bubbles out of the liquids that are in there. Once it's done, we turn it off, release the air, or actually put the air back in. And once we've released that vacuum, we can then take out our newly degassed silicone, and it should be completely bubble free. And the reason we're doing this is because we could pour our silicone straight into the mold, but we would have lots and lots of bubbles when it cures, and it just won't look very good. There are other ways you can do this. If you don't have a vacuum chamber, you can pour your silicone from a height at a very, very thin stream, and that will break any bubbles. You can also, once you've mixed it, leave it for a little while, and some of those bubbles will settle to the top. But to be honest, the best way to do it is to get a vacuum chamber. So I'm going to be mixing our silicone up in 2 pots. I've realized that actually this pot is actually quite full. So if we were to put that into the vacuum chamber now, when it starts to pull the air out of that silicone, it's going to actually boil over almost, and we're going to end up losing a lot of our material. So I'm going to split it in half into another pot, so then we can control that air coming out a little bit better and give it a really good degassing. So I'm just going to decant some of our part A into another pot. Now, something I almost forgot to do was to reserve a little bit of this silicone. And that's for when we come to patch our silicone. We don't have to try and get the exact color. We can just take some of this exact same color as our mask, our base coat, and that then allows us to patch it without any kind of discoloring or different colors. So I now need 400 grams in each rather than 450. I think. Okay, we'll mix our first batch. Now, as soon as I do this, I need to start the timer, and I've got about a 45-minute working time, which is actually pretty good for silicone. Silicone is usually around a range of 8 to 10 minutes, so you don't have that long to work with it. This stuff you have a lot longer, which is nice. Okay, here we go. Just marking my mixing stick. Now we need to give this a good mix, but also while it's in the degassing chamber, it is going to mix as well. Okay, let's turn it on. Now I need to keep an eye on this, that it doesn't overflow. And to do that, I can control the amount of pressure by using this valve. So you can see it's starting to rise. And it should collapse in on itself. There it goes. Now all we have to do is wait for there to be much, much less bubbles. At the moment there's thousands of little bubbles all on the top. That will go down to hundreds and then tens. And eventually there'll only be several bubbles popping up, and that's what we want to wait for. It's going to take a few minutes. Now you can see there's much less bubbles in there now. Still quite a lot on the surface, so we're going to give it a little longer. And again, any mixing that we didn't do with our stick, this is going to be doing it for us. We're almost 5 minutes in, so we've still got about 40 minutes left before this becomes unworkable. Okay, we're about 7 minutes in, so I'm going to check on our silicone. You can see there's very, very few bubbles now, so we can probably turn it off. Now, even after you've turned it off, you can see there are still some bubbles coming out, but actually that's probably an okay amount. When we pour it in, a lot of those big bubbles are going to separate anyway. So we've got a little setup here. We've got our mold sitting here. I've also added a little pour spout up there as well. That's going to help us not make a big mess when we're pouring it in. And I've also got this stuff, which is just a little bit of clay, and we're going to use that to plug up all of our bleeder holes. So we've got about 35 minutes left. We need to start getting this silicone into our mold. Let's just release that vacuum. Now you want to do this slowly, because otherwise if you let too much air in, it's going to either put more bubbles in your liquid or just essentially make it explode inside. So that's looking pretty smooth. Can't see any bubbles. So that's looking good. Let's get it in the mold. Okay, so I'm going to start pouring this bit by bit, and we're going to be looking for these bleeder holes here. Now some of the ones up here will start going first, but we're not going to worry too much about that. It's just a waiting game really. looking at all of those little beater holes. A little bit coming out here, but we know it's not that full yet, so we don't want to plug that yet. Again, some of the top ones are filling, but not any of these bottom ones yet. A little bit coming out of the chin there, but again, don't particularly want to plug those yet. I may have to temporarily plug that chin. You can see it's starting to come out of where the collarbone is there, which is a good sign. That means that it should have filled up from the bottom. If that keeps running, we can then plug it. Looks like it is, so we'll plug that hole. Okay, it looks like it's starting to come out of this one as well, which again is a good sign. It means this bottom piece is filling up. The second batch is almost done. Still nothing on this back hole here. Ah, some here too. Looks like the upper collarbone is now leaking. The good thing about doing it in two halves is you do give yourself a little bit more time, because depending on your mold and the size of the bleeder holes, all depends on how quickly that silicone is going to run into the mold. Also remember, we've got a power mesh hood in there as well, so that's going to be making it run a little bit slower through that mold. Now I'm being very careful when I put this in, because we're now coming up to quite a lot of the holes. This is now starting to come out of the back here, which is great, so we can plug that. Ones are now going. There's still one down here that hasn't bled yet. I'm not sure why. Okay, we've got a bit of leakage down here. Okay, this one is finally going here, which is good. I was getting a bit worried then. Okay, so good news is the mold wall held up really well. There is no leaking from what I can see from the sides or the bottom. So we've got enough bolt holes in, that's fine. Bad news is, I'm pretty sure my calculations were a little bit off, because it stopped bleeding out of the holes round about this mark here. So it seems I didn't quite have enough silicone to reach just the top of the head, which is annoying. But I do still have the reserve silicone that's exactly the same color. So what I'm thinking of doing is mixing up the silicone I've got left. It's only about 200 grams, so I'm hoping that's enough, and matching it as closely as I can to the leftover silicone that we had for patching. Now it's not going to be perfect, but I think after it's painted, I don't think you're going to notice if there is a slight color difference at the top, because remember, it is only the base coat. And then fingers crossed it will fill right to the top, because if not, I'm going to have to order some more silicone, and it's going to take much longer than I really want it to. Okay, well, that wasn't enough. So I've got to go and order some more silicone. Okay, so long story short, I ordered some more silicone. I tried to fill up the rest of the mold and it didn't work. I imagine that the first pour kind of sealed over where the bottom of that tube was, because when I filled it up, it didn't drain into the mold, it just kind of filled up that tube. So we know when we open the mold up, there is going to be some missing space just at the top where those kind of fungus bits are kind of sticking out. So we know that's not going to be complete. Is it frustrating? Yes. But this is one of the reasons why I love doing these sort of projects and these videos, is because you really do learn by doing. And something that worked in a previous project might not work this time, which is the case now. Now I do have a few ideas to fix it. It's not the end of the world. It's just kind of like a minor setback, but it has given me some good ideas of how I would do it next time in a much more efficient way that's more likely to succeed in the first place. And I'll go into those ideas a little bit later on. But what we need to do first is get our mold open and see how the rest of the mask was captured, and inevitably how much patching we actually have to do. And if you've seen any of our previous videos, you'll know that patching refers to the term of fixing any holes or imperfections in the mask with thickened silicone, and that's kind of what we're going to be doing with that top piece that we know is already missing. So let's get it opened up. So we've taken off all of our polymer clay that was plugging all of those bleeder holes, and the first thing we need to do is get all of our bolts off. Now, one thing I will say about this mold, which is a really good thing, is that from what I can see, there's been no leakage out of any of the kind of side bits of the mask, the bits where the two side parts meet. So that means that when we made our mold, we made a really good flat surface around the wall of the edge of the mask. And that seems to have given it a nice airtight seal. Okay, here we go. Now I want to be really careful when I'm opening this, because the silicone has created kind of like a vacuum inside. So if I just brute force this open, it's more than likely going to tear that mask, which is what we don't want. Now again, much like we did when we originally demolded the clay version of this mask, I'm going to use some of these little sticks just to try and slowly pry it open. Now we've got a little gap in that mold wall. I'm going to use a little bit of isopropyl alcohol, as we did before, to try and loosen up some of that mold release. Now I'm going to try blowing a little bit of compressed air into these bleeder holes. Now again, I want to be really careful that I don't use too much pressure, because I'm aware that the compressed air could blow a hole in the mask. Ready for the reveal? You know what, I'm pretty happy with that. We can obviously see at the top here where it hasn't filled up and there's a big kind of gap at the top. But for the most part, the rest of the mask has actually turned out really, really well. I can't immediately see too many places on the mask itself that really badly need to be patched. There's a few little air bubbles here on these high points, which I kind of expected. And there's a little bit here. You can see the color from the permanent marker that I use that's kind of coming through there, but that's fine. We're going to paint over that. You're not going to see that in the final piece. But overall, I mean, from the front, I'm pretty pleased with that. It's definitely captured the detail, the fine details of the pore textures that we spent a long time doing. And I was actually kind of worried about these little bits here, these little kind of tendrils that are coming out of the eyes, and whether it would actually capture that in the silicone. And for the most part, it has. We're going to tidy it up. We're going to cut off all of these little bleeder hole notches that are on here. I can see that it hasn't quite filled up this little bit at the top here, and there's a few little bits up here as well that it hasn't filled. But again, for the most part, I am super happy with it. But we still need to get the back off. But hopefully that will be a similar success story to the front. Okay, so similar as we did when we demolded the clay, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to put it on this pole. We're going to gently push that mold off of our mask. almost there. Okay, let's take a look at the back. Okay, so I can already see a lot more patching needs to be done on the back. We've got some fairly big holes here and here, and also on the top there as well. But they're all in areas that are less detailed and pretty flat, so it shouldn't be an issue patching over those. You can see we've got a little bit of flashing here along our seam line, but actually not a great deal of flashing, and that's actually a really good sign that our mould wall had a really good seal on it, and that's why we didn't get any leakage around the edge. This is our little pour spout on the top, looking questionable, but overall I'm happy with the first result from our first pour. And that's the great thing about having a really solid mould, is that we can pour over and over again, and next time we'll know how to fix some of these issues. Now, there's a few bits in particular, such as these kind of deep crevices in the top here. I wasn't sure how well it's going to capture that, but actually it's captured those deep parts really, really well. Even these little bits in the side here, it's captured all of those really deep crevices that often are prone to air bubbles. We've got a few air bubbles around the side here, but again, patching those isn't going to be too difficult. The biggest challenge is going to be fixing this top half of the mask that hasn't filled up. So the next thing we need to do is get this guy cleaned up and get him patched. So that's the end of our silicone casting process. Now we've come a long way, but we've still got plenty to do to get this project finished. So please join us again next time, where we'll be patching and seaming our mask and getting it ready to be painted. We're so close to getting this mask finished. So as always, thanks for joining us. We'll see you on the next one.